So excited to be here. Tonight, we're going to build a solid foundation to understand why we have government and what principles were used to set up the government that we have. In the following sessions, we're going to look at more specifics of the legislative, executive, judicial branch, state governments, etc. And Trump has made this really exciting and really easy. So based on the Constitution, by the time we finish the course, I think we'll have a really good understanding of what actions could be considered legal, what are quite questionable, and what are clearly illegal. Next. So I'm going to spend a little bit of extra time on this slide. I will not spend this much time on the other slides, I promise. So in the preamble to the United States, we understand why we even have a government. Everybody, liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, independent, etc., we all agree that these are the goals for why to have a government. We disagree on what the interpretation might be. For instance, a perfect union. Does a perfect union mean what some scholars call a tossed salad? And that means we are all in one union, but we have individual languages, individual cultural traditions, individual religions. Or are we a melting pot? I will retain some of my cultural traditions, but I speak basically the language and have the traditions of everybody else in this union. Or are we really all just one union? We all are going to be a Christian nationalist. In terms of justice, to whom does justice apply? Does it apply to everybody? Does it apply to a select few? Will establishing justice apply to the indigent, the poor, the LGBTQ? Will it apply to those constituents with status and those without status? Domestic tranquility. Does domestic tranquility mean absolutely no protests, no rallies at all? Or does domestic tranquility mean absolutely, yes, we want the protests, we want the rallies, we want people to be able to express themselves? May I write a critical editorial safely without being rounded up? Common defense. Common defense, does that include military only? Or is the defense of our nation also dependent on NATO, on our allies, on our soft power policies? General welfare. Does general welfare mean we have a safety net for everybody in our country? Does general welfare mean social Darwinism? Each person out for herself, as Thorstein Veblen said, root hog or die, good luck. And the blessings of liberty. Does that mean I get to do anything I want anytime I want? Does liberty mean my liberty ends where your liberty begins? Or does liberty actually mean, and some of the founding fathers actually believe this, that liberty is a common good? I have liberty within the framework of a common good. Okay, next. Next slide. Yeah, thanks. All right, each of these we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So I just went over the 6 reasons why we have a government. Now what I want to talk about are the 6 principles on which our government is founded. And we'll take each one of these separately. So next, please. And I'm going to back up for just a minute. And here's the answer to one of the questions in the Kahoot. There are 3 different types of government. Unitary, the chart on the next page reads federation. We are going to use the word federalism. And confederation. Next slide. So if we look across the top, unitary, and you look down and you see the United Kingdom, Great Britain is one of these. And then you see federation, we're going to use federalism. And then you see confederation, like the Confederacy during the Civil War. And then you're going to see under unitary, national government is at the top. That is where all the power resides. The states exist to serve the national government, to implement whatever the national government tells them. But notice under federalism, federation, people. We, the people of the United States, we are the power. And then notice the power is further divided into states and national. They are not the same. They have different powers. And then under Confederacy, The states have all the power. The national government under the Articles of Confederation existed to do whatever the states asked them to do. That is a very, very weak national government. Next. Okay, let's talk about the principles now. Next. Federalism. So federalism is unique to the federalist type of government. The U.S. government has certain power. The states have different powers. So the U.S. government has the military. The state powers have the National Guard, for instance. We're going to talk a little bit more, but that's just to get us started. All right, next. The chart just is a chart, a graphic example of what I just said, with the powers of the federal government on the right, powers of the state government on the left, and notice they are equal. They're on the same plane. They do not have the same types of powers, but they have theoretically, the same amount of power. And then in between are the shared powers. Okay, next. All right, so here are some very specifics. And what I'd like to point out is on the right-hand, actually on the left-hand side, those powers that are listed in this chart are delegated to the U.S. government. These are all except for the very last one. They are enumerated. They're very specifically enumerated, specifically spelled out. This is what specifically the U.S. Congress can do. So you will notice, third one down, Congress actually has the right to tax exports according to our U.S. Constitution. And please notice, Congress is the one that sets up our military. And below that, only Congress can declare war. The very last one are the implied powers of Congress. Congress can make any law that is necessary and proper to fulfill the 6 goals listed in the preamble to the Constitution. So you see on the left-hand side, the federal powers very delegated to the U.S. government. The first several are specifically enumerated for our U.S. Congress, and we have a whole section on that. And then there's the implied powers for U.S. Congress. In the middle are the concurrent powers. Both governments can tax. So by April 15th, the vast majority of us will pay U.S. taxes and will pay state taxes. They are not the same, but they both have the power to tax us. They have equal power, but they're taxing, our rates are different for the U.S. and for the state. And roads, for instance, interstate highways are the U.S. government. The state highways are maintained and paid for by the state and the state taxpayers. On the far right are powers reserved to the state. Julie already mentioned the SAVE Act. The states, according to our U.S. Constitution, the states, Article 1, Section 4, are set up to control elections. There is one phrase that the times, places, and manners of holding elections for U.S. senators and representatives, Congress may alter those regulations. The president is not mentioned anywhere in the Constitution as having any power over elections at all. The other thing that I really want to emphasize on the state side, the reserve to the states, is education. And when we talk about the executive branch, which will be our third lesson, we're going to talk about the fact that the Department of Education is part of the executive branch, and we're going to talk about why it exists, if it even still exists by the time we get there, and why it was set up. Okay, next. So I've already mentioned this. Delegated powers belong to the U.S. government. They are found in the U.S. Constitution in Article 1, Section 8. The expressly enumerated, very clearly written, Congress controls exports. Congress can coin money. Congress controls the military. Congress declares war. And then the implied, Congress can do anything that's necessary and proper to fulfill the 6 goals of government listed in the preamble. Concurrent, state and national both have the power to tax. They equally have the power to tax, but it's different types of taxes. And then reserved are powers. The states control elections, the states control education, the states control certifications, the states control permits, the states control licenses like driver's licenses, professional licenses. And each state, and those of us who are professionals and have moved between states, we often have to change our certificates based on the regulations that state has set up. Okay, next. All right, so here's just another diagram of the federal system. And the hint would be the federal system is really important to understand since we've had 3 charts as well as a slide. And this one includes the words delegated powers, concurrent to US and state, and then reserved to the state. Okay, next. And if I start going too fast, somebody please tell me to slow down. I'm perfectly capable of slowing down. A different chart, and the chart is from 2020, so I'm sure the number of local governments has changed since then. We have 1 US government, 50 state governments. Remember, they have equal power, but power in different areas. Local governments in my state exist only at the pleasure of state government. So if the state government decides to cancel a municipality, it's really gone. And then we must include and sue. If you would like to add, this would be a great time. We have 574 Indian, tribal, Alaskan Native governments.
Yeah, and the point to make there is that folks who are members of Indian tribes or Alaska Native governments are U.S. citizens, as are the residents of the territories that we own, like U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam. Actually, people in Guam are not U.S. citizens, they're U.S. nationals, but Puerto Ricans are U.S. citizens. And Indian tribes, though, can vote for a president. Indian tribal members can vote in federal elections, but their votes are counted as part of a state vote, not as a separate tribal vote. Whereas the territories like Puerto Rico and Guam cannot vote for president or any of those national offices. And I think that covers kind of what's important about that in terms of the federal system. Also, Indian tribes are sovereign. They are independent, or they are dependent domestic nations, which means they are sovereign. They have their own governments. They have their own constitutions, their own laws. They have law enforcement. The jurisdiction issues are pretty complicated, but they operate as sovereigns to the extent Congress allows them to. So,
and the next slide, Sue, stay on. Just is a different graphic. Sue, if you want to add anything.
yeah, it's really just the idea. One place where, the tribal nations issue comes up is, or more recently has come up, is in the Supreme Court, when the Supreme Court overruled the Defense of Marriage Act. It did so with respect to state and federal governments, but not to tribal nations. So tribal nations can still prohibit same-sex marriage. The Bill of Rights doesn't apply to tribal nations, but there is the Indian Civil Rights Act. It doesn't apply all of the Bill of Rights to tribal citizens as against their own government. So they're essentially, anybody who's a tribal member or non-members who live on reservations are subject to a third sovereign power that can regulate their lives, their daily lives, on top of their state, municipal, and federal governments.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That can get very complicated, I would imagine. All right, next slide. All right, so we finished federalism, and what I want people to understand and to notice, federalism divides the power. And look what we have in front of us again. We're separating the power in a very different way than federalism. And we're adding checks and balances to that separation of powers. So when this Constitution was written, there was a huge fear of power. We did not like the power that the King George III had. And so we tried to create a government to distribute, to disperse that power as many different ways as we could. So in addition to 3 levels of government, we have 3 branches of government. They are separate, but they do overlap just a little bit in the way that you saw the delegated powers, the concurrent powers, and the powers reserved to the states. Free and democratic countries will only exist with checks and balances. Next. So here's just a basic diagram of the 3 different branches: the legislative, which is Congress, the House and the Senate, the executive, the judicial. Missing from the executive in the diagram are all the executive departments and all the executive agencies, which we will definitely go into in depth because they have really felt a tremendous effect from the current presidency. Next. So the legislative essentially makes the laws and the others that are written there. Executive, and why this is not written in this chart, I'm not sure, but enacts, executes, or enforces the laws. So just as an example, for instance, there was a law passed that criminalized marijuana on national property, for instance, national parks or national courts, U.S. courts, U.S. Parks. And Obama said, you know what? I'm limited in my resources. I'm limited in my money. I'm going to spend more time. And he instructed law enforcement, which is part of the executive branch, enforce law enforcement. He instructed them to go easy on the marijuana and to really concentrate their sources and their resources on marijuana and heroin. When the first 45th administrator, Trump, came in, he said, oh no, we're going to enforce everything equally. And so the prosecution of those persons who had marijuana on federal property increased. Now, if anyone had a problem with either one of those or with the law itself, they would take it to the courts, and the courts will interpret. I will be shocked if the SAVE Act does not end up in front of the courts to interpret. Next. So those were the 3 different branches, and between them are the checks and the balances. This slide has just the easy, everybody take a breath and relax, because we are very familiar with this. We know veto, we know impeach, we know declare laws unconstitutional. Next slide. What I want to emphasize at the very top, if you can see it, my slide sometimes has a little bar on it, is Congress is responsible for the budget. So for instance, in Trump's first administration, he was determined to build that wall. Well, Mexico was not going to pay for it. He had some money, so he built part of the wall. Congress never gave him the rest of the money, so he couldn't build the rest of it. So a president might decide to do something, but if Congress, which by constitutional enumerated rights, specifically delegated Article 1, Section 8, if Congress doesn't give the president the money, the president cannot do that. And then if you'll notice over on the left-hand side, the Congress can impeach judges. Very clearly in the Constitution, judges may only be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. We cannot impeach a judge because we do not like the decision that particular judge made. There are a few more on this chart. I want to emphasize the checks and balances are numerous, thank goodness. Numerous. We have lots of checks and balances. At this moment, it feels a little bit tenuous, I have to admit, but there are quite a few checks and balances in our government because the writers of the Constitution said power is dangerous. It must be divided. 3 different levels, U.S., state, and local. It must be divided in branches, and then we have to put all kinds of extra checks and balances. Next slide. Okay, limited government. I think we've already covered the idea that our government is limited because the power is divided so many ways. What I want to emphasize is We want a limited government, but we do not want a weak central government. We do not want a confederacy type government. We tried that at the very beginning, just towards the end of the American Revolutionary War. I'm skipping time periods, I'm going back. So the American Revolutionary War, through the treaty and through the first few years of our freedom, we had a government called the Articles of Confederation. Confederation very deliberately used because it was really weak. We swung the pendulum away from the king over to a confederacy. I call it the Articles of Crap. They were soft, they were squishy, they were weak, and we had to flush them. They did not protect our people. So we want limited, but we don't want too limited. Once again, popular, people, sovereignty, power. The people in our government have the power. The people are the basis of our power. All right, next. So the very wonderful term consent of the governed, and that is the permission of the people. So on April 5th, I would be willing to guess that a vast majority of us were involved in indicating that at this particular moment, government does not have our permission. We are not giving our consent. Obviously, the most powerful way to give consent is by voting, but we don't have that option right now. And the option that's open to us, and in most of our minds, this is included in domestic tranquility. I do have a right to attend an assembly. I do have a right to write a critical editorial. I do have a right to rally. Okay?
Well, I think resistance will come from individuals. We have different ways in making our voices known in a democracy. Obviously through our votes, also through our presence, whether we go and talk to our elected official or whether we rally in the streets or whether we send letters. All of those are forms of resistance. But I would urge those who are organized to see how you can more effectively not only resist, but contribute. You can find a way to make your voice heard. And I urge you to do that. The force of the individual talent is greater when we work together. All of this is standing up for democracy. I think we are understanding more and more what it means to have the we in democracy. And we includes all of the people, everybody, not just the leaders, because we are the leaders.
Oh, thank you. And the 5 phone calls that people make every day, they make a difference. So rule of law, this one is, this one and due process are certainly creating quite an interpretation, quite an uproar, quite a concern. Everybody is accountable and everybody follows the same laws. We don't have some laws for some people and different laws for different people. Everybody. It doesn't matter my status. I'm not talking just socioeconomic status. It doesn't matter my documented status. Every single person is protected by due process and rule of law, and that is constitutional law. That is not Kirsten Russ just getting up and running her mouth. All righty. Next.
We are in the process of the Second American Revolution, which will remain bloodless if the left allows it to be.
I actually do believe we're in the middle of an American revolution, but it's not his, it's ours. More than 80% of America want things like common sense gun safety legislation, reproductive rights, all the things that we hold so dear. We are stepping up to the plate and saying, no, a few people have tried to take over the levers of power in our democracy, and they're trying to impose minority rule on the rest of us. And we're not going to put up with it. We're going to push back and restore American democracy. So in a way, it's an American revolution, but it is one that reasserts our original principles. We are those people who are the great center of America, who has saved it in the past, and we'll save it again.
Thank you, Heather Cox Richardson. And remember, Monday, you want to listen to her and you want to listen to Jasmine Crockett. Preach, preach, preach. So I was going to say there was one reason, major reason, real quickly, if I may, Julie. I hope this is okay,
Yep.
Julie and Julie. Okay, thank you.
If I can go back a slide even going. No, go
okay.
ahead. Keep going.
So one would wonder, why were all these guardrails put into our government? That is because the men, and I'm sorry I have to use that word, but it's historically accurate, who wrote this document with very strong women behind them, never forget that, believed that they themselves were ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. That comes from the Federalist Papers they wrote explaining why they wrote this document. They're ambitious, they're vindictive, and they were excessively greedy. And they knew that if they were in government, they had to have guardrails. They had to have federalism. They had to have checks and balances. They had to have separation of powers. They had to have due process. They had to have rule of law. Anyway, so thankfully they were honest enough about their own nature to recognize that that's their vision of human nature, and government has to protect against that. And that's it. Thank you. We would love questions. And I think, Sue, you were going to help me, help us with this.
Right. Before we get to that, and I apologize, you gave me, I created 2 slides with your Federalist quotes, and I don't know what happened to them. They disappeared.
Doesn't
And we
matter.
also apologize for the black bar on the screen. I don't know why it's happening, but people keep coming in and coming in. So I know there's been a lot of questions in the chat about why we have a black bar. I don't know why it's there. We can't figure, we'll figure it out next time. Okay. So what I want to share right now, though, is we will definitely get to questions. I also want to quiz you again. I want you guys to see whether you got all that information from Kirsten. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and do another Kahoot real quick, and then we'll take some time to answer questions that were in the chat. I know that Sue's been in there answering a lot of your questions. But anyways, if you guys have enjoyed this and you want to keep going with the series and keep learning, May 21st is going to be our next one, which will be on a Wednesday. And I'm dropping the link here to register. It's going to be this: what does Congress even do? Because I'm sure a lot of us wonder that a lot right now. But we're going to learn about the legislative branch. So come on back on May 21st and we will do that. And then, Julie, I believe the next thing is the Kahoot. If we want to get people back into Kahoot, we're going to do a quiz and test what you guys have learned. So going to go back to kahoot.it. All right. What are the 3 branches of the U.S. government? Yahoo! Okay, you learned. Kirsten taught you. Very good, everybody. Oh, Smarty McSmarty. Okay, that's a very cute name, whoever is that, whoever has that one. What is federalism primarily about? State and federal powers, only federal powers, local government only state powers. Y'all are too smart. Okay. Federalism is what Kirsten's talking about, how we have divided government, and that the federal government has some powers and the states have some powers, and then they have some shared concurrent powers. Awesome. Smarty McSmarty, you are still up there. Okay, you guys catch up. Come on. Federalism limits government power. I feel like this is going to be a good one. Everyone's going to get this one. Yep, true, because you divided the power. So the states can do things, federal government can do something. So if nobody has all of the power, so it does limit government power. All right, Smarty McSmarty just must have super fast fingers. So What is the purpose of checks and balances in government? Woohoo! Okay. We are all smarty McSmarties, but we're gonna see. Okay. You guys have a couple more chances to catch up. What does rule of law mean? Very good. The law applies equally to all. I know it doesn't feel that way right now, but that is the way the Constitution and that's the way our government is supposed to work. Oh, Billy jumped ahead. Smarty McSmarty. Uh-oh. Okay, let's see what happens. Which is a federal power? Declare war. This is something that only the federal government can do. Federal power. LC, jump to the top. What is a state? Which is a state power? Education. Okay, very good. All right, let's see. All right, now LC is hanging on here. All right, this is the last question, last opportunity to get to the leaderboard. States can ignore federal laws. False. States have to follow federal laws. All right, you guys got super smart, I believe, during this lesson. Number 3, LA. Number 2, MD. Number 1, the fastest fingers, Ellen. Okay, that came out of nowhere. Hi, Ellen. Good job. All right, I'm going to stop my screen share and we are going to take some time for Q&A. So I'm going to bring us up here. I'm going to bring Sue up and she can let us know if there was any good questions in the chat that we need to answer. I'm going to bring myself up and
Muted myself. Okay, yeah, hi. So a lot of the questions were in response to what I was talking about with tribal governments, and sorry, I don't know that I was particularly clear on that. I apologize. So members of tribal governments can, of course, vote in their state elections in which they reside, where their reservation is located, or the part of the reservation on which they reside. They can vote in federal elections there, and their votes will be counted as in just with the rest of the population of their legislative district, not as a separate entity, as a tribe, as a tribal nation. They don't have additional electoral votes. The residents of the territories, do not have the right to vote in federal elections. They don't have any electoral votes for president simply because they are not states. So definitionally by the Constitution, states get electoral votes. Because they are not deemed states, they do not have electoral votes. And that sucks, but that's where we are. There is some representation. There are representatives from those territories. There's a representative of Guam, but they don't necessarily have voting rights in Congress. That means they can be in Congress, but they don't have a whole lot of power. Um, DC is a district. Similarly, they are controlled by the federal government. They have home rule, but their home rule, similar to tribal nation sovereignty, is limited to the extent Congress lets them exercise it, meaning Congress can overrule a DC law, which they talked about in Trump's first term about protests, I think. And when they painted the Black Lives Matter across the streets, Congress wanted to order them to remove that. And all the territories are actually overseen by the federal government as well. They might have local um, officials who are implementing that, but all of them, except for two, there are two that are controlled by Colombia that are technically U.S. territories, but Colombia um, oversees them. I think that's kind of interesting. But anyway, the point being, it's really hard for the people in territories to get representation, um, which is one reason there's been
I did see
a
a question.
move to, huh? To
No, go
move
ahead. I was going to say,
to make them states. But anyway, the other questions, there were some questions about executive orders, and I think we talked about doing a session on executive orders because the quick answer is executive orders are really orders to the executive branch of how they are to proceed. They're basically memos from the boss of the executive branch telling the executive branch what to do. And that's fine. Trump is using them in a way to suggest that he can create law and he can issue an executive order that's binding on Congress, the courts, and citizens. And it's not. They're really essentially a lot of what his executive orders come down to are tweets. They're just tweets put on memo paper. The problem is it's not reported that way. It's reported as a credible thing that he's doing, and enough people don't remember civics or didn't cover this in civics, and they think it has the force of law, and it gets scarier than it is. And it also gets scarier to the extent Congress and the courts are not going to stand up to him. That's my cheerful answer on that.
there was a question I saw in
Oh, I couldn't hear the
there was a
question.
question I thought was interesting. Somebody asked if Jamie Raskin talks about how the legislative branch is actually the most powerful because they make the laws and they control the power of the purse. I don't know what you guys think about that. I was just curious about your perspective on, is there a more powerful branch, or what do you think we'll get into the legislature in our next session, but
Do you have a response, Kirsten? Or do you want me to?
First, and I'll follow up. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, I mean, sure, you could make that argument, but then, fans of the Supreme Court could argue, well, we're more powerful because we can strike down the laws that you pass if we find that they are unconstitutional or we just disagree with them. Theoretically, it should not be for the latter reason, but that's theoretical. And then the president can say that I'm the most powerful because I command the military and I determine the enforcement of the laws. So you can pass your petty little laws, but if I decide I'm not going to enforce them, then or my executive branch is not going to enforce them, my Department of Justice, which is how Trump talks about it. But even during I think it was the first Obama administration, when President Obama said he wasn't going to, or they were not going to prioritize enforcement of marijuana laws in states that had decriminalized marijuana. So they can have an effect too. And throughout our histories, and Heather Cox Richardson talks about this, there has been sort of the rise of the presidential power and then waning of presidential power, the rising of legislative power, and so it sort of ebbs and flows for each branch. Ideally, under the Constitution, they are co-equal branches of government and they should serve as checks and balances on each other. And we're losing sight of that right now because the right believes in this unitary executive theory where the president has the power and right now we're in a really unfortunate situation because they've felt this way for a long time and they've argued this for a really long time. But now we're in a situation where they have a Congress that is willing to abdicate its constitutional authority and responsibility and let the president run roughshod over everything. And I won't get into agencies. We're going to talk about agencies later, but that's another problem. Agencies are incredibly powerful. You might have heard a case about the overriding of Chevron deference, which gave agencies a lot of power to decide how regulations should be interpreted. They were given deference by the courts, and then the Supreme Court said, no, we're going to let courts decide. And what's interesting about that is initially, when the Chevron decision came out, Republicans were opposed to it. They did not, or in favor of it, because they didn't want the courts to decide, because they decided that they viewed the courts as being activist and liberal. And so they wanted the executive branch, which was controlled at that time by Richard Nixon, his administrative agencies, his experts to decide the interpretation of these regulations. Now things have come full circle where the executive is in the hands of a President Trump, and the desire is to have the agencies not have that power. Well, actually, no, I'm getting that wrong. I'm saying then there was sort of a switch when Obama was president and when Democrats were president. That's what I mean to say. Oh, we got to get the agency control away from those Democratic administrations, and we'll give them back to the courts because Republicans have spent decades filling the courts with Republican appointees. And then they switch back. And then they get Trump, and then Trump announces he's going to interpret all the laws. And I don't know how the Supreme Court is going to respond to that. So, sorry,
So,
that
Kirsten,
probably
do you wanna-
over answers your question. I'm sorry, I can't help myself sometimes.
No, I was going to ask Kirsten if she had anything she wanted to say about like the different branches in terms of like the power that they have. And then also I've seen people asking questions a little bit about the Supreme Court and the rule of law. So if you want to expound on, people are worried, can the courts actually enforce their rules? And, why are we seeing some of the things? Okay. So give your thoughts on that, Kirsten.
I was going to say one problem, well, from my viewpoint, one problem with Congress right now is the Republicans are supporting the president instead of our Constitution. And that significantly weakens the power of Congress.
Yeah.
And what was your second question, Julie?
Just about the courts and, upholding the rule of law and,
Oh,
also the power of the courts to actually enforce their laws or their
well,
decisions.
the president enforces. I think Sue is nodding her head. Go for it, Sue.
Yeah, well, I mean, so the famous, probably apocryphal story is Jackson saying the Supreme Court or Justice Marshall has made his decision, let him come and enforce it. And the reason the rule of law is so important is because the rule of law is really held up by faith, right? It's held up by our faith and belief that that the laws apply to everyone equally. And we obey the law because it is the law. And I'm having a really hard time teaching this idea to law students right now because there's a lot of cynicism about this idea. But yeah, the Supreme Court doesn't have a military. It doesn't have a police force. It does have marshals, right? So that it can enforce contempt. And I don't want to suggest that it's all lost. Like I don't want to be a doomsayer, right? Because generally people do follow the law. They do what the courts tell them to do. And even this administration has backed down when, in some situations, when the court has told them what they're doing is wrong. Courts have the power of contempt. They can impose fines. They can put people in prison for disobeying their orders. The question then is who arrests them to put them in prison? And that's another sort of structural problem. But it doesn't mean that they're completely unenforceable. It means right now, because of the situation we're in with this executive and his lawlessness, it becomes harder. But I don't want anybody to come away thinking it's hopeless and it's not going to be enforced. Today, the Supreme Court did not uphold or did not strike down the decision from the lower court that the president needs to get Mr. Garcia back from that El Salvadorian prison where he was sent without any due process illegally. Now they played some games with the language of the decision, but they did say it's the president's, it's that they must facilitate his return. They can't say, well, we disappeared him and now we don't have anything. So, and that was what the administration was arguing, which is a terrifying argument. And SCOTUS said, no, we are not going along with that. Now we're all waiting to see what he's going to do.
Yeah, that was a pleasant surprise to see that they. Go ahead, Julie. Sorry.
I'm sorry. There's a question in the chat that I know that we don't have time for because we're at time, but maybe it can be addressed in a future one. And someone, because I have actually heard this argument a lot myself, the difference between democracy and a constitutional republic, because that is an argument that the other side actually brings up a lot, that says that we are not a democracy, that we are a constitutional republic. And a lot of us don't have a good reply for that. So if that could be addressed.
Yeah, I think we're going to bring that up in a future one. My general reply is first ask them what the difference is and let them explain it, because they will not know. We are both. NPR has a great explainer on their website, but we are both. But just explain it. You explain it to me then, the difference, and you'll be told to do your own research.
And then tell them we're actually a federal republic.
Yes.
They've got it wrong.
Yes.
Everybody, that's your homework, I think. So go look that up. That is your homework. We'll come back to that. So thank you so much to Kirsten for presenting tonight.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Julie, for running the slides. And I don't know why we had that black bar. We'll figure it out for next time. So, okay.
Because I kept taking it back out and then it still kept coming back. So,
yeah. Well, technology is not always
Thank
our
you,
friend,
everybody, for
so
coming.
Thank you all. Have a good
All your good
evening.
questions.